My name is Victor Furman. Some call me The Voice. I've always been fascinated with human nature, spirituality, science, and the crossroads at which they meet. Join me now and we will explore these topics and so much more with fascinating guests, authors, and experts who will guide us to Destination Unlimited. Imagine what you perceive as the perfect life. An amazing and prestigious career, a beautiful family, a well-appointed home, and yet something is drastically wrong. You feel pressured, incomplete, and in many ways a failure. What is missing, and what can you do to turn this around? Is there a spiritual practice that you can turn to for answers? My guest this evening, Dr. Greg Marcus, has a BA in biology from Cornell University and earned his PhD in biology from MIT. He worked for 10 years as a marketer in the Silicon Valley genomics industry, after which he became a stay-at-home dad, writer, life balance coach, and biotech consultant. Greg's first book, Busting Your Corporate Idol, Self-Help for the Chronically Overworked, is a 5-star Amazon bestseller. Greg is a practitioner, facilitator, and innovator of American Mussar, a 21st century spiritual practice for an authentic and meaningful life, and he shares about it in his brand new Llewellyn book, The Spiritual Practice of Good Actions, Finding Balance Through the Soul Traits of Mussar. Welcome, Greg. Welcome to Destination Unlimited.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Victor.
Thank you. Now, my introduction to this evening's interview painted a picture of the American dream gone seemingly awry, and this, in essence, was your story. Please tell us about it.
Well, I really thought that I had my dream life. You know, I had a very nice family, a wife and 2 kids. I had what I thought was my dream job. I was in marketing, super cool way to use my technical abilities. And then I got placed in charge of a very important project. It turned into one of those projects where everything went wrong. We had all kinds of technical issues. We made our launch date because I had everybody work nights and weekends and cancel vacations. And it got to launch and it flopped. It flopped in every single customer's hands, and management blamed me. I went through a very difficult period at work. I was publicly humiliated by the president. I went to a trade show where my best customer presented terrible data on the product, and I had to spend all day tap dancing and telling everyone that we would have fixes. And that night, when I was walking to a bar to blow off some steam with some of my colleagues, my phone rang, and it was my mother telling me that my grandmother had passed away. So this all really hit me like a ton of bricks.
A true dark night of the soul.
It was a very dark night of the soul, and I just went back to my room, and I got very tearful, and to my I'm a little embarrassed to admit this, but I was considering skipping the funeral so I could stay and kind of finish the work that I was doing. I mean, my head was in the completely wrong place at that time.
In Jewish families, even in non-religious Jewish families, that's a big no-no.
That is a big no-no. And my mother was like, look, come on, you were close with your grandmother. And so, but they did hold the funeral a day. I mean, this was, so I was really off track at that point in my life. So 2 weeks later, I went into Yom Kippur, which is the Jewish Day of Atonement, and we fast all day, we don't eat, we don't drink, and we really reflect on our life. It was about 3 p.m, and I was sitting there, and I looked at the translation of the service, and these words jumped out at me: don't turn to idols or molten things. And so my first thought was really dismissive. It's like, oh, it's that statue thing, it's not really relevant. But then this phrase just popped into my head: you need to do what's best for the company. And when I thought that, my hands got sweaty and my stomach clenched, and I realized that I had turned my employer into a false idol. And doing what's best for the company is not the same as doing what's best. And I decided right then and there that I was going to turn things around. I was going to start putting myself first. I was going to start putting my family first. And within a year, I'd cut my hours by a third without changing jobs, and my career got better, my health got better, my relationships got better, and nobody at work even noticed. And that was the moment that kind of started me on the spiritual path that I'm on today.
You know, it's interesting that this occurred on Yom Kippur, which is the Jewish Day of Atonement. I had a wonderful spiritual teacher since past who used to tell us that the word atonement actually means at one-ment, where you become at one with the sense of spirit and the spiritual path in your life. Is that what happened to you?
Absolutely. I had a similar teacher. It wasn't Rabbi Alan Lew by any chance, was it?
No, it wasn't. No, I'm talking about Rabbi Joseph Gelberman.
Okay. Well, yes, that is very much when you really focus inward and you take a hard look at yourself, you really can become at one and accept who you are, and that opens up choices and possibilities for going in a different direction.
Absolutely. Now, I have to admit that Musar was unknown to me until I read the advanced copy of your book. How did you find Musar?
I discovered it. It was about 6 years ago. We chose instead of sending our kids to Sunday school, we did a family-based religious education program. And one year, the theme. So we went all together, and we would sometimes be together as a family, and sometimes we'd split for adult study and kids study. And one year, the theme was Musar, and it's something that none of us had ever heard of, and it really reached me. And I sort of thought about it. One of the things I really liked about it is it's all about taking small, gradual steps. When I was cutting back my hours from 90 to 60 in a year, I did it in small, incremental ways. And Musar works in the same way, where you take these small, incremental steps. So I was thinking about it, and a couple of years later, I went to one of our rabbis and said, I really want to teach Musar. And she said, great. We'd love to have a class in it here. And then I said, and I need to learn Musar too. And she said, fantastic. And so the synagogue actually paid my tuition to take this online Musar class. And from the Musar Institute, it was called Everyday Holiness. And just a couple of months later, I started teaching my own class, where I was using what I learned there, plus doing lots of reading and work on the internet to pull together a curriculum for how could we use, initially it was a class on how can we use Musar to achieve work-life balance.
Interesting. I heard this lesson actually many, many years before that teacher from someone else at a Friday evening service that I used to attend. It was a kind of a new age type of thing. And this woman who was well into her 80s at the time, and I was a young man in my mid-30s, noticed that I was kind of uncomfortable about some of the things that they were discussing and practicing. And one Friday evening, she called me over after the event was over and said, I'd like to share something with you. She said, I look upon you as a son, and I would say this to my own son. She said, God does not require or mandate that we be holy, but God would love for us to be whole. And when she said that, that changed my life. That actually put me back on the path that led me to the person that I am today. That concept that embrace everything that you are. And if you don't embrace everything, you're denying yourself, and you're really not doing what Spirit would have you do. Do you have that same sense about this practice?
I do. There's another. There's a concept in Judaism called repair the world. The Hebrew phrase is tikkun olam.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And there's an accompanying phrase which is called tikkun midot, which means really repair of the self. Mm. And in many ways, Musar is about how can we repair ourselves? How can we, one of the things that I write in the book is I think of it that we all have a divine spark inside, but it's occluded by our baggage. Mm. And Musar really helps us bring balance and healing to move those bags out of the way and let our goodness, and whether you are unsure about the divinity or not, we all have a common element of goodness, a common spark of humanity. And when we allow that stuff to get moved out of the way, that goodness shines forth.
Absolutely. Now, did you find it difficult to go from an MIT doctorate and hard science to a spiritual path?
I didn't at all. It was a very natural transition for me. Grew up in it wasn't exactly a secular household, but we went to just services on the high holidays, and I didn't think I was a particularly religious person, but I was always interested in the mysteries. I mean, at the boundaries of science, it's about the mysteries and the unknown, and spirituality is really it's about the same thing. It's about why are we here? It's just a different lens of looking at the same problems.
Now, many people are familiar with the study of Kabbalah. How does Musar compare with the study of Kabbalah?
Well, the way I think about it is Kabbalah is like spiritual mystical, and Musar is spiritual practical. So it focuses very much on the everyday. How can we cultivate its character development? How can we cultivate humility, patience, honor, truth? And so, in some ways, maybe it's a little tiny subset of Kabbalah.
And why is Musar not more widely known, or is it a practice that you have to be ready to embrace and then it finds you?
Well, unfortunately, Musar was almost lost in the Holocaust. It was very common in Eastern Europe, especially among the yeshivas or the Jewish high schools, and almost all of the teachers and practitioners perished. And thanks to the work of many teachers over the last 10 or 20 years, like Iris Stone or Ellen Moranis, Musar is starting to become more widely known and available.
And my guest this evening is Dr. Greg Marcus. He's the author of the new Llewellyn book, The Spiritual Practice of Good Actions, Finding Balance Through the Soul Traits of Musar. And we'll be back with more of Greg and the study of Musar after these messages on Destination Unlimited on the OMTimes Radio Network.
Have you ever wondered how to change your love paradigm? The secret key is finding a love partnership, not just a regular connection. How do you find these? Through conscious relationships. Ascending Hearts Dating is a dating site for people like you that believes in second chances and a different type of spiritual connection. Try Ascending Hearts for free today at ascendinghearts.com and change your love paradigm. Ascending Hearts, the premier dating community for the spiritually awake.
Hi, this is Sylvia Henderson, intuitive life coach and energy healer. Are you ready to elevate and rise way above your normal? Be sure to listen to my show, Intuitive Transformations, on OMTimes Radio, Sunday evenings at 9 p.m. Eastern. Get the inspiration you need to transform your life.
When I was little, I didn't talk for a long time. I was sensitive to lights and sounds, so I built secret hiding places where they couldn't get in. Sometimes I did the same things over and over, until one day I found out I had autism. My family got me help. Slowly, I learned how to live with it better.
Early intervention can make a lifetime of difference. Learn the signs at autismspeaks.org/signs. Brought to you by Autism Speaks and the Ad Council.
Circle of Hearts Radio is a sanctuary on the airwaves. Join me, Grandmother Elia, in the circle on Sunday, 2 p.m. Eastern, as I share information to both enlighten and nourish your soul.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this evening is Dr. Greg Marcus, author of the new book, The Spiritual Practice of Good Actions, Finding Balance Through the Soul Traits of Musar. So, Greg, before the break, we were talking about how you got involved in Musar. Now, you founded American Musar on 3 basic tenets. What are those tenets?
So as I was developing my class and developing kind of my wrinkle on Musar, I noticed sort of some things that were really important to me. And the most important thing was to make Musar accessible. I mean, if you look at the Jewish population across the United States, many are, the vast majority are not members of a synagogue. Many don't speak Hebrew, but they still are very interested in Judaism. And similarly, there's many spiritually minded people who aren't Jewish, but are interested in wisdom literature and interested in what Judaism has to teach. So my areas of particular emphasis on Musar is one, focusing on the Jewish values through everyday living. I mean, in its essence, Judaism is about being a good person. There are certain values and certain ways that we can conduct ourselves to be a good people. So that's number one, the Jewish values to everyday living. Number two is there's no Hebrew except for the word musar. And doing some research for the book, I spoke to some people who were not members of synagogues, and I, wanted to understand what Judaism meant to them. And it came out that not only was hearing Hebrew words kind of a little bit uncomfortable, it actually caused shame in some people. And I experienced that myself. I mentioned this family program that we were a part of, and one of the rabbis, a wonderful woman, she always said, Kol hakavod, Kol hakavod. Well, I didn't know what that meant. And for 5 years, I was too embarrassed to ask. And I realized, one of the things that Musar teaches us is that it's incumbent on the speaker not to make other people uncomfortable. So if Hebrew was really kind of causing shame and discomfort, I would take the Hebrew out, including the transliterations. And that also makes it more accessible to the broader community. Now, for people who want to delve deeper, I have an appendix where I kind of go from the English word to the kind of traditional Hebrew words. So for people as they want to continue their education, that's available. Oh, the third one was I provide alternatives to God talk. There's a lot of people who are really unsure about the divinity, and as soon as they hear the word God, they kind of stop listening. And so, whenever I talk about God, I also say, and if you're unsure about the divinity, you can think about it as the universe, or you can think about it in some other way to try to make it, again, more accessible to people so that they can really take advantage of this wisdom literature without getting hung up on some of the traditional hang-ups that people have about religion.
Now, does one have to be a Jew or even religious to practice Musar?
No. Absolutely not. Musar is about becoming a good person. I mean, it is a Jewish practice, and it draws on, thousands of years of Jewish wisdom. But it is there's nothing ritualistic or denominational about it, and I think it's open for anyone who it's kind of a treasure for anyone to share in if they're interested.
Now, a lot of the good deeds or good actions, there's a word in Hebrew. So the actual word in Hebrew is mitzvot, which a lot of people think means a good deed, but actually is a commandment. And there are 611 commandments beside, many are familiar with the 10 commandments, but there's 611 commandments in Judaism. And many of them deal with doing good deeds. So is that the foundation of this work?
Yeah, I mean, you could think of it as a way. There is so the 611 commandments that you mentioned. They're in the book called the Torah, which are the 5 books of Moses. And there's a teaching that there's 48 ways of acquiring Torah, which means to really learn it and internalize it. And the first way is to read it and study it. And then there's 48 other ways. And Musar is about those other ways. It's about experiential learning. So one of the soul traits, for example, is one of the principles of Musar is enthusiasm, and you want to run to do good. So it's that, if a door needs to be opened, you don't saunter over and do it. You kind of put a spring in your step, and you go and you open the door for the woman who's struggling to get it open with her carriage, or the older person with a walker. That sort of thing.
Absolutely. It's interesting how we think about and take for granted some of these things that are common courtesies and good manners and just caring and being kind to one another. And I think this world of ours that we're living in today is in true need of people who will practice that, who will practice kindness and goodness. Well, it certainly would be a much better world if more people did. And it's it's interesting, and one of the eye openers for me was the Jewish teaching that it's not enough just not to do any harm. We're supposed to proactively do good. So it's not that again, it's like, okay, well, I'm sitting over here and there's someone over there who's struggling with the door. You could say, okay, not my issue, but what Musar would teach is, hey, you are obliged to get up and help that other person. So it's literally compassion in action. Yeah, absolutely.
That is very much a part of it.
Now, you use the Yiddish word Mensch to describe one of the outcomes of practicing Musar. What is a Mensch, and how does one become a Mensch?
So a Mensch is a person of outstanding character. They're like a pillar of the community. I opened the book talking about my mother's first cousin, Sandy. He was a Mensch, and I think he was a Mensch. There's really three things I could point to. He always showed up for every family event, whether it was a big event or just somebody's birthday party. He never said a bad word about anyone, and he always had a sunny disposition. And I think we all have what it takes to be a Mensch, but what we need is we need kind of a guidebook. And Musar is that guidebook, those guidelines we can take to be a Mensch. And it's really finding those things inside that cause us to get stuck in the same situations again and again, and bringing them towards balance and healing. And as we heal ourselves, as we do the tikkun midot, we become Mensches.
One of the things that I learned from that spiritual teacher of mine, Rabbi Gelberman, was that we have, all human beings are comprised of two inclinations. We have the left-hand inclinations, they say, and the right-hand inclinations. The left-hand inclinations being, for example, seeing someone in need and not taking action, and the right-hand inclination being seeing someone in need and taking that action. How does Musar combine or look at these two attributes?
Well, so what the terminology that I learned to describe those are and what I use in the book they're called the evil inclination and the good inclination. And evil it's not a great translation of the Hebrew term, but it's the best one I could come up with. It's not like the Charles Manson, I'm going to kill everyone sort of evil. It's more like our reptilian instincts, our fear reflexes, our drives, our selfish instincts, our reptilian brain. And the good inclination is the more social, I want to help other people. And one of the core principles of Musar and Jewish teachings is that there's a constant battle between this good inclination and evil inclination. And we're faced with tests. We have a test that comes up, and a test occurs when we're kind of right on the crux, where we could go towards helping or not helping the other person. And that's where we need to exercise our free will, and that's where Musar helps guide us towards making the right choice.
Now, what inspired you to write The Spiritual Practice of Good Actions?
The book grew out of a class that I mentioned how I created this class, and I'd been teaching it for 3 years, and it just went wonderfully. And we had about a dozen people every year. We formed these amazing communities. It changed people's lives. And at the end of 3 years, I looked at all my notes and I said, this is a book. I have to share this with other people. And the book just flew out. My first book took 4.5 years to do. This book was done in less than a year. I just really felt called to do it.
Mm. And how does your book differ from others about Musar?
Well, I think, in Judaism, there's a concept that we're in dialogue with those that came before. And I think this book is kind of the next step in that ongoing dialogue. So I mentioned some of the things that tactically I do about the alternatives to God talk and the English only to make it more accessible. But I also try to use very modern examples from the corporate world, from things that I experience, kind of side by side with some of these examples from the Talmud and the Torah, to really make it very actionable and accessible to people.
And I think that's the important word, accessible, because when something is too esoteric or too difficult to understand, people get easily dissuaded and say, I can't handle this is too much for me. And by doing it in this way, you're giving accessibility to virtually everyone. Yeah,
that's my hope. And what's really nice about Musar is it doesn't expect us to kind of become a mensch overnight. If I am a really impatient person, if I'm like, cursing out other drivers, I'm not expected to just suddenly become very different. But I have seen, and one of my students did actually, for her practice of patience, she said, okay, I'm going to start letting other drivers go in front of me.
There you
and
go.
She said, And she said it was just like transformed her entire drive. She said she did like within 3 days of doing this, she was just calm and pleasant and listening to music. And but it was just taking that one small step that led to this bigger change.
We'll discuss something like that after the break, but I want to tell everyone that my guest this evening on Destination Unlimited is Greg Marcus. He's the author of the new Llewellyn book, The Spiritual Practice of Good Actions, Finding Balance Through the Soul Traits of Mussar. Greg, please tell our listeners how they can get your book and find out more about you and American Mussar.
Well, you can find the book on Amazon or any bookstore or library. To find out, I would invite you to come to AmericanMussar.com, American, MUSSAR.com. I have a soul trait quiz there. It'll take you just a couple minutes. It's a great way to start looking within and learning about Mussar.
And my guest this evening, Greg Marcus, his book, The Spiritual Practice of Good Actions, Finding Balance Through the Soul Traits of Mussar. And we'll be back with Greg after these messages on the OMTimes Radio Network.
You're listening to OTR-FM, part of the IOM Radio Network.
Are you in an interfaith relationship and thinking of getting married? For 18 years, Reverend Laurie Sue Brockway has been creating personalized, loving, and romantic ceremonies for couples of all faiths and cultural backgrounds. Reverend Laurie Sue's sensitivity to the needs of interfaith couples is reflected in the compassionate and inclusive way she addresses the concerns of parents and families. Reverend Laurie Sue is also the author of several best-selling books on interfaith weddings and wedding vows. Selected as one of the top interfaith officiants by New York Magazine, Reverend Laurie Sue serves couples in the New York metropolitan area and beyond. Find out more at her website, yourinterfaithwedding.com.
OMTimes Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. OMTimes, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Do you have time to read that inspiring book or that blog post you've been meaning to get to? In your busy world, how do you improve yourself and keep your life going? I'm Lisa Kay, and my Between Heaven and Earth radio show can transform your life just by listening. Be uplifted with inspiring topics, positive stories, and ideas that really work. Between Heaven and Earth radio is conscious living for your soul, every Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time.
When I grow up, I want to be a new pair of blue jeans.
When I grow up, I want to be a kid's first computer.
When I grow up, I don't want to be a piece of garbage. And if you recycle me, I won't be.
Give your garbage another life. Recycle. Learn how at iwanttoberecycled.org. Brought to you by Keep America Beautiful and the Ad Council.
And we're back on Destination Unlimited. My guest this evening, Dr. Greg Marcus, author of the new Llewellyn book, The Spiritual Practice of Good Actions, Finding Balance Through the Soul Traits of Mussar. Greg, before the break, you were talking about how people take little steps and start finding significant changes. And one of the little steps that I've taken in my spiritual path, and I have not studied Mussar, but again with this wonderful teacher I had many years ago, he used to say, we're given 2 ears and 1 mouth, listen twice and speak once. And I was the type of person who would, when I was a younger man, I was very angry. And if someone said something that I disagreed with, I wouldn't wait for them to take a natural pause in conversation or even contemplate what they were saying. I would just immediately spout out and respond in an angry fashion. And when he gave us this teaching and I was developing on my path, I learned to stop and listen fully and thoughtfully and completely. Not only listen with my ears, but listen with my heart and soul to what someone else has had to say before responding. Is that sort of one of the practices that you would see in Musar?
Absolutely. That's kind of several practices sort of all wrapped up into one. But, listening to other people, I mean, there's elements of, I'm hearing elements of humility. It's like, okay, well, is my opinion so much more important than this other person's? Really, I should be honoring the other person and giving them my full attention, because often when they're saying something we disagree with, they might be speaking from a place of pain or a place of ignorance, or they might be speaking about something which can offer us a new perspective and something that we hadn't thought of. So
Absolutely.
There are few things that we can do that are more important than listening.
So let's talk about that. Using the spiritual practice of good actions, how does one get started in Musar?
Well, what I recommend people do is they, as I mentioned before, I have a quiz that I offer people, which really gives you a chance to look across 13 different soul traits. So let me explain what a soul trait is. So we all have a soul, and for thousands of years, people have been trying to understand what the soul is. Well, what Musar does is it defines soul traits. They're kind of parts of the soul. And Musar is what one of my students calls, it's like extreme spiritual fitness. Where it's like going to the gym where you will focus on one muscle group at a time. So with Musar, we focus on one soul trait at a time for 2 weeks. So it might be, okay, I'm going to focus on humility for 2 weeks. So I would start in the morning with a mantra, which I would say for a couple of minutes and meditate on this mantra to kind of set the framework. Then I would pick what's one small incremental step I could take during the day that'll bring me towards balance. And then I'll journal about it at night so that I can kind of capture and help lock in those small changes in the soul that we've experienced during the day.
So can you give us an example of what that mantra might be for humility?
Right. So for humility, this one mantra that I really like that was written by my teacher, Alan Moranis, it's no more than my place, no less than my space. And one of the key things about Musar, which is really different, is having too much of a soul trait is just as bad as having not enough. So if we have too little humility, we're an arrogant person, that has all kinds of issues. If we have too much humility, we can become really self-effacing and we cannot take care of our own needs. And so we all have a unique spiritual curriculum. So for me, it's okay, well, where do I sit on this spectrum? And it might be that, using the example from earlier, I need to talk a little bit less. I need to give more space to other people. I need to listen more. But I might be the kind of person who's afraid to talk. I might sit there in a meeting and be afraid to ask questions. And for that type of person, the next step might be to ask a question. And it might be to take a little bit more space and to recognize the worth that we bring to that situation.
So in essence, what we're talking about is having a healthy and balanced ego.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's many facets to that. There's the humility facet, and then there's other Musar soul traits like order, which are, if we have too little order, we get things that are chaotic and disorganized, and too much order, they can be so rigid that we almost don't have any freedom, and we cause stress for ourselves trying to control everything. So it's finding, and again, that can be related to ego, because it's finding, it's letting go of outcomes.
One of the things that I teach to my sales team in my day job is to take ownership of customer satisfaction. Is there also taking ownership as part of one of the soul traits?
Absolutely. We are ultimately, and I think part of the Musar journey is to really recognize, looking within, that a lot of the time when we find ourselves in certain situations, we've caused ourselves unnecessary pain. And by practicing Musar, we can learn to recognize, our contribution to these painful situations, and that it's our responsibility to take some action to get out of them.
What about catastrophization? Many of us have this tendency to see the worst possible outcome based on either our upbringing or socialization or things that we've previously experienced in our lifetime where things have not been so great, and only to find that if we're prepared and do things in the proper way, things work out perfectly, exactly as they should. Is that part of the study too?
Yeah, so there's one of the more challenging soul traits is called trust, and it can be short for trust in God or trust in the universe. But part of that is recognizing that most of the time when we worry about things, none of that ever takes place. It's like that old Mark Twain saying, some of the worst things I experienced actually ever happened. And we spend so much mental energy like worrying about, well, this could happen. If that happens, I'm going to do this and that. But usually things turn out okay. And so learning to let go a little bit and trust that things are going to work out lets us let go of that catastrophization, and it's recognizing that, even if something bad happens, I can trust myself that I'm going to be able to handle it.
I think that's a really important one. So for our listeners, and I'm going to encourage everyone to go out and get your book, because the Spiritual Practice of Good Actions will give you all of these soul traits and give you exercises and ways of approaching them. But let's talk about trust. If my practice that we're working on right now in Musar was trust, how would I go about? What would be my mantra? What would be my daily practice?
Okay, so the mantra for trust. This one is actually one of my favorites. It's called, I use trust in God, but tie your camel. And it's from a phrase in the Islamic world, trust in Allah, but tie your camel. And the idea is that, you can trust in something bigger, but we have our part to do as well. Or trust in God, but lock your bike. If you've meditated on that for a while, you then, as you go through the day, you start to recognize situations that are coming up where you send an email off to someone and it's like, okay, I'm just going to assume this is all going to turn out okay. And you realize, well, maybe I'm exercising too much trust. This person is new on the job, or they're new to the company, and maybe they don't understand the way we do things here. And I should maybe just trust in the outcome a little less and just tie my camel a little bit more. Whereas we might recognize that, maybe we might recognize that we're a micromanaging boss, and that employees that have been there for 10 years and have a great track record, we're still giving minute details, and we could be trusting them more to get the job done.
Absolutely. I remember a story that one of my spiritual teachers shared many years ago about the gentleman who was very pious, and he regularly attended worship services. And on one of these days, he gets down before the altar and he looks to the sky with his hands together and he says, "Dear God, my wife needs an operation. I don't have any money. Please let me win the lottery this week, please." And the week goes by and he doesn't win the lottery. And the next week he goes to this worship service again, and he gets down and he's wrenching his hands and tears are coming out of the corners of his eyes, and says, "God, I don't understand. I've always been faithful to you. I've always been following your word. I need to have this money for my wife. Please let me win the lottery this week so she can have the surgery." And again, the lottery day comes and goes, and the next week he is absolutely beside himself and wringing his hands and crying and moaning and saying, "Why, God, why are you punishing me? My wife needs this surgery. I need to win the lottery. Tell me what to do." And a voice from heaven comes down and says, "Buy the ticket." So many of us are faithful and live a good life, but aren't willing to buy the ticket, because the teacher told us that whatever we do in this life, God will be with us, or the Lord will be with us, or however you see the divine will be with you. But it's also a teamwork process. It's action together.
I love that story. It's really, it reminds me of the Woody Allen saying, and I quote this in my book. I think in the trust chapter, it's 80% of life is showing up.
That's it.
And what he meant by that is that so many people come to him and say, oh, I really want to write a screenplay and I want to get it sold and whatever, but they never write the screenplay.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, if you never write the screenplay, it's never going to be made into a movie.
Absolutely.
But if you write it, then you have that opportunity. You might just win. And the way I've kind of come to understand trust is I don't expect any particular outcome, but for me, the way I think about it is that I trust that God is always going to be there to hold my hand, whatever happens.
Mm.
Now, 5 years ago, I might not have thought that, and some listeners might not be ready to go there, but there's always someone, whether it's God, whether it's another person, there's always someone there to hold your hand when you need it.
And ultimately, the old story about the gentleman who's in the sea and he's drowning, and the Coast Guard clipper comes and is about to throw him a life preserver, and he says, I trust in God. God will save me. I don't need this. And then a helicopter comes by, and again, about to drop a lifeline to him, and he says, I trust in God. God will save me. I don't need this. And a number of these activities happen. And then he drowns, and he meets his maker, and he says, I don't understand. He said, I trusted in you. What happened? He says, I don't know. He says, I sent the boat guard, I sent the Coast Guard. And again, we're looking for sometimes we're looking for miracles in the Technicolor, the Ten Commandments movie style, when we're actually seeing them all around us and just don't know how to appreciate them.
Victor, there are miracles around us every day in our eyes and heart to see them.
Absolutely. My guest is Dr. Greg Marcus, author of the new book, The Spiritual Practice of Good Actions, and we'll be back with more of Greg on Destination Unlimited after these words from the OMTimes Radio Network.
It only takes a minute to find out if you may have prediabetes, and you can do it at doihaveprediabetes.org. But you're probably not going to, are you? Kids, work, listening to the radio. You're busy, which is great because busy people can't get prediabetes. Oh my, I read that wrong. They can. Should have worn my glasses. So visit doihaveprediabetes.org and take a short test, because prediabetes can be reversed.
Brought to you by the Ad Council and its pre-diabetes awareness partners.
As difficult as it is to believe, there are places in Africa where human traffickers sell albino children and their body parts for use in magic rituals. Humanity Healing International is actively working in Uganda to change this paradigm. The Albino Rescue Project finds albino children who are at risk and places them in safe schools and environments where they can learn and grow free from fear. To learn more or to sponsor a child, visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
Hi everyone, this is Shay Parker, the host of Best of the Best, which airs live right here on IOM Radio every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific. I'm super excited to bring you expert guest hosts, spiritual discussions, free psychic readings, and so much more. I can promise that you will not want to miss this one-of-a-kind, fun, yet touching, down-to-earth show. Join us every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Pacific on OTR-FM. This is Shay Parker, and I can't wait to see you there.
Hi, this is Bill Maher. I can find humor in almost anything, but one thing I never laugh about is cruelty to animals. If you don't get the joke either, write People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, 501 Front Street, Norfolk, Virginia, 23510.
And we're back on Destination Unlimited. My guest this evening is Dr. Greg Marcus, author of the book, The Spiritual Practice of Good Actions. And Greg, in your book, you discuss 4 assumptions about the soul. What are the 4 assumptions?
So let me give you a little background on why I did these assumptions, because there's many people out there who don't know a lot of the backstory of Judaism. And sometimes when you read these books or you approach a spiritual practice like this, you get many, many chapters that try to summarize thousands of years of teaching. So when I was in the business world and had to do a business forecast, we would create assumptions. We would say, okay, if we believe these things, if we assume these are true, then everything within this forecast is true. So what I've structured within the book is I created 4 assumptions about the soul where I ask people to, even if they don't believe them, just for the sake of argument, assume they're true. And I revisit them throughout the book and see where that takes you on the journey. So the 4 assumptions are, One is that we all have a divine spark that's occluded by our baggage. Two is that we all have the same soul traits, but different amounts of each. The third is that we're driven by this conflict between the good inclination and the evil inclination. The fourth is we all have free will, but it's not always accessible.
Go into that one a little bit more.
So free will is such an interesting thing. And I think the easiest example is like when I get upset at my kids, for example, or I get upset at my wife, some things come out of my mouth before I even think about them. And it's out of my mouth and I'm like, oh geez, what have I said? That just poured gas on the situation. That is not helpful. That was hurtful. And so I guess you could say in theory, I had free will where I could have not said that, but it sure didn't feel like it. And so that's where I think is a case where my free will wasn't accessible. There's a Rabbi Pear used to say that what Musar does is it helps us increase the space between the match and the fuse. So by practicing Musar, we're better able to access our free will, so we might slow things down a little bit and have more self-control and stay on a more even keel so we don't throw gas on the fire in situations like that.
Absolutely. You talked about getting angry with your kids, and in your book you call Musar parenting the art of being a better parent by first becoming a better person. Please share what you mean by this.
Well, there's a lot of advice out there about how to parent your kids and, what to do about screen time or this or setting boundaries or what have you. But what I find most challenging is there's not really a guideline for how do I how do I parent myself? And what Musar does, again, is it teaches us how to become a better person so I can become more patient with my kid. I can be less frustrated. I can be more loving and compassionate. And with two teenage girls,
yes.
Challenges come up.
Absolutely.
But, life is lived in these small moments, and it's the sum total of how we show up in these challenging situations. When I'm by myself, I'm the best parent in the world. But when a teenager is being a teenager, or my wife has had a hard day and I've had a hard day, that's the challenge. That's when we need to show up as our best self.
Absolutely.
And that's where Musar helps.
You talk about parenting yourself. Let's say that you came from a situation where you had either an absent parent or a parent, when I say absent, perhaps not there at all, or someone who worked many, many hours and really was not there as much as you would have liked them to have been there, or a parent who perhaps would be angry and just come at you with that anger when they wanted to discipline you. How would you address that situation using Musar?
Well, so what's interesting is as you go through Musar, you practice each soul trait for 2 weeks, and it always seems like the soul trait you need is the one that shows up right when you need it. So often, if we've been raised with anger, that can be an issue of feeling disrespected, not feeling honored enough. And if we're not honored as a child, then we have trouble giving honor to our own children. So if I'm practicing the soul trait of honor, I might think about the divine spark of my kids. And sometimes if they are, I remember once when they were younger, and I used to get really mad when they would take a long time, getting out the door in the morning. I was still working. It's like, come on, we got to get out the door. And I was practicing honor, and all of a sudden I just envisioned them as these innocent babies with these little divine sparks, and just my anger just melted away. And it was just the most incredible moment. And this big smile, I just was sitting, I still remember it, I was sitting at the breakfast table, and I just got this big smile on my face and said, okay, here they go again. They're just messing around being kids.
And how did that make you feel?
I felt wonderful.
Yeah.
I felt great. And, it never feels good. Like you yell at, there's a saying in Judaism that anger, it starts in madness and ends in sorrow.
Absolutely.
And it never feels good to get angry or frustrated with your kids. And it was liberating.
There's a couple of expressions that come from various religions that relate to what you're talking about. One is, there but for the grace of God go I. And you recognize that commonality of that's something that I'm capable of doing. And in doing so, you're exercising compassion. And in exercising compassion, you're letting go of whatever anger would be penting up and coming through with true compassion, so you can sort of embrace that other person with compassion. And the other one in Buddhism is the Buddha in me recognizes and acknowledges the Buddha in you. And if we see that within each other, then all anger and all difference dissolve.
Kind of recognizing that commonality between people. I mentioned one of the assumptions was, we all have a divine spark occluded by our baggage. And sometimes our baggage prevents us from seeing the other person's divine spark.
Absolutely. As an interfaith minister, I often counsel couples who want to bring elements of their respective heritage and culture to their children. What does Mussar have to offer to Jewish interfaith and multicultural couples?
I think Mussar has a lot to offer because it is very much dealing with, when we're talking about soul traits or behaviors, things like patience and trust and truth and silence, when to speak, when to not speak. These are character traits that are drawing on a wisdom tradition that have to do with everyday life. And there's nothing about rituals, there's nothing about attending a synagogue. It's something that a couple can share. And I think every culture has its ways of dealing with patience and dealing with some of these other things. And it can give a common Jewish framework for a couple to work on, which doesn't have the kind of religiosity that some other practices might.
Now, you say you wrote your book primarily for cultural Jews. What about non-Jews or non-religious Jews? Can they get something out of it?
I really think that everyone could get something out of it, because the fact of the matter is that we all have issues. We all have things inside that cause us to get in our own way. And Mussar is that ability to bring healing to that.
And in our world with so much anger and so much pain and people being divisive with each other, what about approaching Mussar from a standpoint of bringing it to everyone?
Well, I would be, it's an interesting thing because Mussar is, it's a practice that I think everyone can benefit from. I think we can all start. It's, your question reminds me of, I was meeting with someone who was helping me with my website, and there was some car that came kind of tearing through a stop sign and went screaming around the corner, and this person said, oh, well, there's someone who really needs some Mussar practice. And I thought about it, and I didn't say this because I didn't want to be rude, but I was like, well, I would be doing that same thing, except I'm doing the Mussar practice.
Absolutely.
It's really easy to kind of look around at, oh, that person really needs to be improved, and oh boy, that person really needs to get their act together. I think when we take responsibility for ourselves, when we take up a Mussar practice and we start feeling the benefits of being more patient, being more calm, seeing our relationships improve, finding that we don't kind of get stuck in these same situations again and again, that is catching, and other people will gravitate towards you and say, wow, I want to try this too.
So a Mussar practice really is a way for every individual to get to the essence of what is called the golden rule, to do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
There's a famous story that Rabbi Hillel was asked to summarize the entire teachings of Judaism while standing on one foot. And he essentially gave the Jewish version of the Golden Rule. That which is hateful to you, don't do to another.
Yeah.
And all the rest is detail.
Absolutely, so true. What we didn't do is we didn't define the word musar. What does the word musar mean?
So it means to correct or adjust. In modern Hebrew, it also means ethics, but really it's about making these small corrections. And we all have the ability to kind of take that one next small step. We don't have to change overnight, but it's what's the right step for me to bring me just a tiny sliver outside of my comfort zone.
My guest this evening, Greg Marcus, author of the new Llewellyn book, The Spiritual Practice of Good Actions, Finding Balance Through the Soul Traits of Musar. Greg, once again, please tell our listeners how they can get your book and find out more about you and American Musar.
Well, you can go right now to Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com and order a copy of the book. And I would welcome you to come visit my website, AmericanMusar.com. I have a lot of free tools where you can get started with a Musar practice. There's a free soul trait quiz, which takes you about 5 minutes. It's a little quiz to start looking within and seeing where your point of balance is across 13 soul traits.
Greg, thank you so much for being with us, and I believe that Musar and your book and the entire movement is something that our entire world can benefit and heal from. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
And I'm Victor the Voice Furman. You've been listening to Destination Unlimited on the OMTimes Radio Network. Have a wonderful week, everyone.